Welcome back to Becoming Ultimate Masters. You know we love diving deep into all sorts of fascinating topics. Today we're going way back to the early 1900s to the Uganda Protectorate.
Yeah, it's a total trip back in time to see how these tribes lived and what they believed. Might seem a little strange to us now.
For sure. Our guide for this journey is a book called The Northern Bantu by John Roscoe.
It's a classic in anthropology.
Definitely. So Roscoe focuses on four main tribes: the Benyoro, Benyankol, Bakine, and Bagesu.
Each one with their own unique way of life, shaped by where they lived and their beliefs. And just to give you a visual, we're talking a diverse region, mountains, lakes, rivers, the whole shebang.
Wow, that's quite the mix. So how did these tribes interact with their surroundings?
Well, the Banyora, for instance, they were pastoral people, big on cattle. And get this, they had a powerful king and a whole system of sacred cows.
Sacred cows. Now, that's something you don't hear every day. What made them so sacred?
These cows were called unkorogi, and their milk was like super special. Only one guy, the caller, could drink what the king left over.
That's wild.
Yeah.
It really makes you think about how they saw the world, you know?
Yeah.
What about the other tribes? Did they have similar beliefs about cattle?
Cattle were definitely a big deal for many East African tribes. Like the Banyankol, famous for being really tall, they were also super connected to their herds.
Oh, yeah, I remember reading about that. Their height was pretty remarkable. But what about their connection to cattle? Was it anything like the Benyoro?
Well, they had all these specific practices for taking care of their cattle. They had rituals for watering them, used smoke to keep flies away, even had special herbs for when the cattle got sick. Real dedicated, you know?
Wow, that's impressive. They really understood their animals. Did they also have a king who controlled all the cattle, like the Benyoro?
Yep, the Banyankol had a king too. But here's a twist. Their social structure was really different. They practiced both polygyny, meaning men could have multiple wives, and polyandry, where women could have multiple husbands.
Whoa, that's definitely not something you hear about every day. What led them to have these unique marital practices?
Well, it's probably a mix of things like inheritance laws, available resources, and just, how their society worked. It shows that what's normal can be totally different depending on where you are and when.
Absolutely. So we've got the cattle-loving Banyoro and the tall Banyankol with their unique marriages. Who's next in this cultural mix?
Let's talk about the Bacony, the masters of the water. These folks built their homes on floating papyrus reeds on lakes and rivers. Talk about making the most of your environment.
Floating homes. That's straight out of a fantasy novel. What was their construction like?
They were experts at weaving and thatching these papyrus reeds to create these really sturdy homes. They were built to last and perfectly adapted to their life on the water.
I'm trying to picture these floating villages. What a sight that must have been. Did they have a king, like the Banyoro and Banyankol?
Nope, the Bikanese didn't have a single king. They had a headman in each village who acted as the leader, sort of like a judge, helped by a council of elders. It was more about local leadership.
Interesting. So a more community-based approach. Now tell me about their way of life. What did they do for sustenance?
Fishing was their main gig. They came up with all these clever ways to catch fish. Their lives were totally entwined with the water, and their social structure reflected that.
It's amazing how their environment shaped everything, from their homes to how they lived. And now we can't forget about the Bagesu. They had a practice that might be a little unsettling for some listeners.
Yeah, the Bagesu practiced cannibalism. It's a sensitive topic, for sure, and we need to approach it with respect and understand it within its historical context.
Absolutely. So what might have led them to adopt this practice? Was it purely out of hunger?
Well, there are a few theories. Scarcity of resources is one, but it could also have been ritualistic or even a form of social control. It's a complex issue with no easy answers.
So there's a lot more to it than meets the eye. It's a reminder that we need to be careful not to judge past cultures by our modern standards. What else can you tell us about the Bagesu? What were their beliefs and rituals like?
They had these really elaborate initiation ceremonies, both for boys and girls, marking their transition into adulthood. They also believed in all sorts of spirits, including rock spirits, who they believed could influence their lives.
It seems like all these tribes, even with their differences, had a strong spiritual side to their cultures. I'm really curious to learn more about the Banyoro and their kings. How did they choose a new king when the old one died? Was it a peaceful handover, or was there more to it?
Let's just say it wasn't a simple handover. There was a whole lot of ritual and even, you could say, a bit of drama
Or
involved.
drama. You've got my attention. Tell me more.
So when a king died, the main chiefs, they would guard his body. And meanwhile, his sons, the princes, would get their followers together and basically fight for the throne.
So not exactly a smooth transition of power then. What about the chiefs? Did they get involved in these power struggles?
Nope, the chiefs stayed neutral. Their job was to guard the king's body and make sure nobody tried to claim the throne too early. These power struggles could go on for months, sometimes even years, until one guy came out on top.
Wow, that's intense. So once a new king emerged from all this, what happened next? Was there some kind of formal ceremony?
You bet. The Banyoro believed in spirits big time. So the coronation was a huge deal, full of rituals to keep those spirits happy and make sure the new king's reign went smoothly.
I can only imagine how elaborate it must have been. Were there any rituals that really stand out?
Well, the new king would go up this hill called Aipeme and stand on a special rock with some princesses and his wives. But here's the crazy part. If any other guy tried to join them on that rock, boom, they'd kill him right there.
That's pretty harsh. Why would they do that?
They believed it would transfer the guy's life force to the new king, make him stronger. It's a reminder that power in a lot of cultures has been linked to sacrifice, even violence.
It's definitely different from how we see leadership today, that's for sure. What about those sacred cows? Did they play a part in the king's daily life?
Oh, yeah. Remember the collar? The only guy who could drink the leftover milk from the sacred herd. Every morning, he'd drive the herd past everyone, and everyone had to hide their faces. It was like super taboo to look at these cows.
Wow, even the king had to look away. So what happened after the cows passed by?
The collar would bring milk to the king from the sacred herd. The king would drink his fill. And then, yep, you guessed it, the collar would drink whatever was left. Nobody else could touch it.
It's really fascinating, all these rituals and their meanings. What about the king's diet? Apart from the milk, did he eat normal food, or were there special rules for that too?
He did eat other food, but yeah, rituals were a big part of it. In the evenings, a special cook would prepare roasted beef for the king. The beef had to come from a year-old animal from the sacred herd, roasted on wooden spits. But get this. Before bringing the food to the king, the cook had to cover himself in white clay head to toe.
White clay. That's a new one. Was there a reason for that?
It's thought that the white clay symbolized purity, like to make sure no bad spirits or anything could mess with the king's food. Remember, the Banyoro, they were really into their spiritual beliefs.
Yeah, everything had a deeper meaning for them. What about the king's mother? Did she have a special role in all of this?
The king's mother, she was like super important. She got huge estates, tons of cows, and even the king would call her mother. Total respect. And here's the thing. Even if the king's real mother passed away, they'd choose another woman from her clan to take on that role.
So it wasn't just about blood ties. It was a position of power within the clan itself. It shows how important family and lineage were to the Banyoro. What about everyone else, though? The people who weren't royalty? What was life like for them?
Life for regular folks was definitely different from the royal court, but there were still a lot of rules and customs they had to follow. All the land belonged to the king, though people could settle on it with his permission. And if they did something wrong, like adultery or stealing, the punishments were pretty harsh.
What kind of punishments are we talking about here? Anything like those ritual killings we talked about before?
Well, ritual killings were for specific situations, but yeah, punishments for crimes could be serious. One way they decided if someone was guilty or innocent was the poison ordeal.
Poison ordeal. How does that work?
So two people who were having a dispute would drink this poisonous drink. The person who could stand up and walk after drinking it was innocent. The other person, well, they were guilty, obviously.
That's a terrifying way to decide. What if both of them got sick or even died from the poison?
That's a good point. It shows how risky and unfair that system could be. There were probably times when innocent people suffered or even died because of it. Their idea of justice was definitely not the same as ours today.
Yeah, it makes you appreciate how far we've come with our legal systems and human rights. So what were the specific punishments for things like adultery or stealing?
It depended on what they did. For men, adultery usually meant a big fine. But for women, it was way worse. They could be banished or even killed. It shows how unequal things were between men and women back then.
That's awful, but unfortunately not that surprising when you look at history. It reminds us that fighting for equality is something that never really ends. Let's switch gears for a bit. We haven't talked much about the Benyankol, the tribe known for being so tall. What else made them stand out?
Well, besides their height, they had some pretty interesting social customs. Remember how we talked about them practicing both polygyny and polyandry?
Yeah, I still can't quite wrap my head around that one. How did that actually work in their society? Were there specific rules about it?
Polygyny, men having multiple wives, was probably more common than polyandry, but both existed, probably because of things like inheritance and how they shared resources.
It's amazing how different cultures have approached marriage and family. What other customs did the Banyankole have that were unique?
Okay, so they had this custom about dealing with conflict in a marriage. If a woman was seen as irritable and abusive by her husband, they'd send her to a sacred lake to get purified.
Wait, irritable and abusive. That seems kind of subjective, doesn't it? What did this purification involve exactly?
Basically, a priest would make her drink stuff that made her throw up and, have diarrhea to cleanse her system. Then they'd wash her in the sacred lake and she could go back to her husband.
That sounds more like a punishment than a purification, especially if the accusation was unfair. Makes you wonder who got to decide what was considered abusive back then.
You're right, it's likely the men had more power in these situations. It shows how even traditions that seem spiritual or helpful can actually be used to control people.
It's a good reminder that we should always question traditions, even the ones that seem normal or harmless. Speaking of social dynamics, how did the Banyankole deal with crimes like manslaughter or murder? Did they have punishments like the Banyoro?
They did, but instead of focusing on punishment, they were more about compensation, about restoring balance. Like, if a man was guilty of manslaughter, he would have to pay a fine to the victim's family. But not with money. Remember, cattle were everything to them.
Ah, so the fines were paid in cattle. That makes sense. But how did they decide how much a life was worth in cattle? Was there a fixed number, or did it depend on the situation?
That's where it gets interesting. The value of the fine depended on a bunch of things, like the social status of the people involved, the specifics of the crime. To give you an idea, for a murder, the fine could be up to 100 cows.
100 cows, that's a lot. Shows how seriously they took these crimes. But were all cows equal in these fines? Like, did the type or age of the cow matter?
You got it. It wasn't just about the number. The specific type and color of the cows were important too. Like a young, healthy cow was probably worth more than an old one.
Wow, even their legal system was full of symbolism and tradition. It wasn't just a transaction, it was a whole cultural exchange.
Yeah.
How did this actually work in practice, though? Did the families always get the full fine? Was there anything to make sure it was fair?
Those are great questions, and they lead us to some even more fascinating details about the Banyan Coal legal system. But you know what? I think it's time we shift gears for a bit. We've talked a lot about the Banyuro and Banyunkle and their focus on cattle. What about the Bikini, the ones living on those floating homes? What were their social structure and customs like? Right? The Bekini. They were fascinating. Totally different vibe from the Banyuro and Banyunkle. Remember? No king. Each village had a headman and a council of elders to handle things.
Right, a more community-based system.
Yeah.
Made sense for their lifestyle. So, how did inheritance work for them? Did they pass down property like the other tribes?
Their system was pretty unique. When someone died, their stuff, their canoe, fishing gear, their hut, everything didn't automatically go to their kids. Nope. The clan members would choose an heir from among themselves.
Interesting. So it wasn't just a straight line from parent to child. What happened to the deceased person's spouse and children?
The wives were free to go back to their own clans, taking their personal things with them. But the children, they'd stay with their father's clan. It was all about keeping the clan strong and united.
Makes sense. A very different approach, focused on the community rather than individual ownership. It's amazing how many different ways there were to handle these things. Okay, we can't wrap up without circling back to the Bagisu. We talked about their cannibalism, but what else can you tell us about their culture and beliefs?
Well, the Bagisu were kind of a mystery in many ways. Their practices made them pretty isolated from other tribes, but they had a rich culture with traditions and beliefs that were, well, different but very meaningful to them, like their initiation ceremonies. Those are pretty intense.
Tell me more about those ceremonies. What went on?
Boys would be off on their own for weeks, going through tough trials and learning what it meant to be a man in Bagesu society. Circumcision was a big part of it, marking their transition to adulthood. The girls had their own ceremonies too, focused on becoming wives and mothers.
Sounds like these ceremonies were all about teaching the next generation, passing down knowledge and skills and their way of life. Do they have any particular beliefs about death or the afterlife?
The Badesu, just like many other tribes, they were deeply spiritual. They believed in all sorts of spirits, especially rock spirits, who they thought could affect their lives, good or bad. They did rituals to try and please these spirits, hoping for good harvest, protection, success, all that.
It makes you think, no matter our background, We humans are always trying to understand the world around us, looking for meaning, for answers to life's big questions.
Exactly. Learning about these cultures, even the parts that might seem strange or even scary, it helps us understand the human experience better. It shows us the incredible variety of beliefs, traditions, and ways of life that exist and have always existed all over the world.
Well, folks, that brings us to the end of our deep dive into the Northern Bantu. What a journey it's been. We explored the lives, the beliefs, the traditions of these remarkable tribes, the Banyoro, the Banyankol, the Bukene, the Bugesu.
We saw how differently they lived, how they formed their societies, their families, how they interacted with their environment and found meaning in life. Fascinating stuff.
If you're hungry for more, definitely check out John Roscoe's book, The Northern Bantu. It's full of amazing details and will really make you think about human history and culture in new ways. And hey, if you enjoyed this deep dive, subscribe and share it with your friends and family. Let's get more people thinking about these fascinating topics.
And if you want to go even deeper, explore personal growth, all that good stuff, visit our website, www.ultimatemasters.org coaching, or shoot us a message on WhatsApp at +256-771-324119. We'd love to hear from you.
Thanks for coming along on this adventure with us. Until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep becoming ultimate masters.